The continuing spiritual adventures of Ed and Lorraine Warren in film have come once again and led us to The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, the third Conjuring movie, but a part of the bigger Conjuring cinematic universe. You could make the argument that the last Annabelle movie, Annabelle Comes Home, was like The Conjuring 3. It was like The Conjuring 2.5, but this one is a story focused on Ed and Lorraine Warren trying to help another family deal with another situation involving the supernatural, but this time the movie goes in a bit of a different direction. It was directed by Michael Chavez, who also directed The Curse of La Llorona, which I thought was a little bit of an underrated movie. Not the best movie, but definitely not as bad as some said it was. And he's taken over for James Wan, but James Wan is still the producer and the co-writer, not of the screenplay, but of the story here being told. This story is, of course, inspired by the events of the 1981 trial of Arnie Johnson, who murdered somebody, and basically the story was that the occult was involved because demonic possession, and that is, of course, where Ed and Lorraine Warren come in. Obviously, Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga returned to reprise their roles as Ed and Lorraine Warren, this time trying to help prove that Arnie Johnson was not the one who willfully murdered his victim, and that instead it was something that was supernatural. Now, obviously, this movie continues the Conjuring verse, but unlike the previous films, this movie is not a haunted house film. There are some elements of the haunted house. In fact, they get it done in the first scene of the film, because the opening scene of the film is the Warrens trying to help exorcise this young kid who has a demon inside of his body, and that ends up leading to the major plot of the film, which is where the demon gets transferred over into Arnie, and he ends up being in possession, being the one possessed, that is, and executing a friend of his that would lead to him being put on trial. Now, the idea of them taking the Conjuring universe and taking it out of the haunted house, I think was a good idea. And I think that with this movie, I like the fact that it tried different things. This movie felt a lot more like a suspense thriller than just supernatural horror, but it certainly gets more supernatural as the film progresses. There's lots of supernatural horror involved here. There's lots of stuff with Satanism and, demonism and, all the things that are staples of the Conjuring franchise. But this time, the enemy that they face is not entirely supernatural, in that there's a human element here, and one that's not really been discussed in the past in these Conjuring movies, but also one that I feel like is essential, because you can't just have the same haunted house movie over and over again. The first Conjuring film I felt was probably, the best one. The sequel kept up some similar tropes, except it was in the UK. Some of the other spin-off movies, I feel like, take the Conjuring haunted house formula and apply it to different locations. The church, for example, in the Nun movie, and, the old, distant past farmhouse in Annabelle 2. However, here, it's not like it's just a house with a bunch of supernatural disturbances. No, in this movie, the murder happens relatively early in the film, and it's up to Ed and Lorraine to kind of retrace their steps and figure out what's really going on. And it involves this whole story with this demonic cult and these really high-level satanic worshipers, and it ends up going in a different direction, which I was actually perfectly fine with them going in this direction, because, like I said, you can't just keep this going. I think the strength of this film is on the performances of Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga. Patrick Wilson, I'm a big fan of his, and even though the actor looks a lot more in shape than the real Ed Warren, this movie gives him a bit of a handicap, because early in the film he has a bit of a heart attack, and so because of that, he can't really be the action hero that he was in the first movie. Really, in many ways, Lorraine has to be the hero here, more so than before. And also, this movie really delved a lot deeper into Lorraine's psychic powers. The credibility of the Warrens has come into question in real life, but within the Conjuring universe, we know that Lorraine has a degree of psychic power. Some would call it intuition in the previous movies, but in this movie, it's far beyond that because in this movie, she actually does a form of astral projection where she can transport her body, or not her body, her spirit, her soul, that is, somewhere else. She also is able to like discover and retrace things that have happened in the past and more so than before. Like, it's almost like her psychic powers are enhanced for this movie. Now, whether or not you're okay with that comes down to whether or not you believe in this because really the Conjuring movies compared to the real life files of Ed and Lorraine Warren, they obviously are going to be a lot more cinematic. You're going to have a lot more drama. The final act of this movie, the big climactic scene with what happens with Ed Warren, which I'm not going to spoil here for those of you who have not seen the movie, that's totally like not even, it's not even a thing. It's not even like something that I believe for 1 second happened in the real world. I can believe some of this stuff. I can believe that there are cults out there that worship Satan. We have proof of this. These people exist. But this idea of what happens with Ed at the end, you'll see it when you haven't seen the movie yet. To me, I thought was a bit, I don't know, a bit much, and definitely not something that happened in the real story. But they always take the story and take it to a new level. Now, joining them in this film is, I can't even pronounce this guy's name, Ruari O'Connor. He plays Arnie Johnson, kind of a young guy over here trying to play the role of this very conflicted person who knows that he didn't do it. He knows that he didn't commit this crime, but he has to kind of struggle with his own internal, his own dealings with this demon to control himself from executing the end of this curse or this situation, so to speak. I thought the special effects in the film were probably on par with the previous Conjuring movies. It definitely does not have the same atmosphere. It doesn't have that slow build up, that slow burn, that sort of creepy unveiling. This is different. In this movie, they kind of figure out right around the second act what they have to do. And then the purpose of this film is for us to join them on their journey to finding the solution. Like, their whole thing is you're joining Ed and Lorraine Warren on this quest to try to find the source of this problem. There's a bit of a subplot here as well about, it's not really a subplot, but it's like a plot point about Ed and Lorraine and like in the past and like when they were younger, when they first got together, and how they first kind of, met and fell in love and whatnot. And I felt like it was kind of shoehorned in just to give the movie a reason for the decision that happens at the end to happen. And then the final scene of the film is a throwback to it. It wasn't really necessary here. I think it was just done to kind of add more development in their eyes. I'm guessing this is what they were thinking for Ed and Lorraine, but it's not really necessary because the story's not really about them. They are the main heroes, yes, and they're here trying to help. And so we are following them on this quest, but the story is really about Arnie Johnson and the problem here. They're the problem solvers, they're the heroes, but it's not about their backstory. It's about them right now trying to solve this problem in spite of the fact that Ed is handicapped and that Lorraine's very spiritually sensitive. But I'm telling you now, if you're expecting that haunted house element where the movie just is trying to be very atmospheric and scare you, you're not going to get that here. This is probably the least scary of the Conjuring movies, but that doesn't make it less interesting. I think that the story of Ed and Lorraine trying to solve this problem and solve this murder and figure this out is an interesting story nonetheless, although I do feel a little bit different, a little bit mixed about like what the actual revelation is. They reveal some things close to the end, and it just came off a little bit like there wasn't enough foreshadowing there, and there's like a twist near the end that I thought was a bit, I don't know, it wasn't the best twist, and you could kind of see it coming because it was kind of foreshadowed. It wasn't foreshadowed at the beginning of the film, at least. Well, maybe it was a little bit, but well, actually, no, it was foreshadowed. Let me take that back. It was foreshadowed, but you figure it out later, so it's good foreshadowing. But it's also one that I thought was, oh, okay, so like they introduce a character, and then that character ties into something else later. and you're not really expecting that, but you kind of are. And then when you look back on the film, you're like, oh, well, I mean, I guess that tied that together, but does that really make sense? Obviously, none of that is how the actual case went. You can actually look up information on this case. I mean, it's out there. 1981 Arnie Johnson case, The Devil Made Me Do It, which is basically what it was called because he basically blamed the devil. But of course, in this version of the story, it's different because, it's the Warrens that kind of figure out that there's something much more sinister involved. Special effects I thought were relatively fine. They were used mostly early in the film. Like I said, don't expect this movie to be the scariest film of the year. Don't expect it to be one that's going to be on the same level of true supernatural horror as the previous two. But if you are already invested in this universe, and if you like Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga, and if you like these characters, then go see The Conjuring 3, because it is a continuation of the previous two movies. It does go in a different direction, and you never know, you might actually like it. I liked it. I didn't love it, but I liked it a lot, and I think that them going out of the haunted house thing, did it cost them that atmospheric tension of dealing with a haunted house? Sure, but the franchise has to go somewhere else. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again and making it more into a suspense thriller. That's fine. You have to remember that these movies, when it comes to horror films, every time you have a new sequel, and this is the case with almost all horror franchises, it becomes harder and harder to replicate that first movie. Look at every single horror franchise. They usually get worse or they end up going in different directions. It always happens. So they really had no choice. I feel like going forward, it may be best if they either retire these characters or maybe give them one more adventure and then kind of go off and do spin-offs. I just feel like it's not the best Conjuring movie, but if you're already invested in these characters, just go see it. You're not going to have a bad time. It's a good movie. It's a good film. It is in theaters and HBO Max right now, but obviously watching it in theaters is way more atmospheric, so I would advise you to do that. We'll talk soon.